welcome back. After 2 years of COVID, more and more questions are being asked about the virus and also the way it has been tackled. Many experts from the worlds of science, medicine, and also the law have voiced concerns, not just about the vaccines, but about the way our societies have been turned upside down. So all-encompassing has been the strategy applied by one government after another. The freedoms and rights compromised or taken away entirely. It feels like every aspect of life has been affected. My next guest is Dr. Mike Yeadon. He has a background in biochemistry and toxicology. For 17 years, he was Chief Scientific Officer for Pfizer UK, specialising in allergies and respiratory conditions. From the start of the outbreak of COVID, Dr. Yeadon has been an outspoken and often controversial critic of the official handling of the pandemic. He joins me now to explain his fears. Hello, Mike. How lovely to see you there.
Hello, Neil. Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me on your show.
No, it's a pleasure to get the opportunity to hear your voice in real time. Could you first of all, Mike, tell us your background, the context in which you sit?
Yes, certainly. Yes, I would say I'm a professional biologist. So as you say, I have a degree in biochemistry and toxicology. I don't usually brag, but I was top of year. I then did a research-based PhD in respiratory pharmacology. Then I worked for 7 years at the Wellcome Research Labs, and then 17 years at Pfizer's Sandwich Labs UK. And as you said, I was head of worldwide research for allergy and respiratory. I left 10 years ago on very good terms. I had a lovely time at Pfizer. They were a very good employer. And then over the last 10 years, I've been a consultant to 30 biotech companies. Some are public companies now. And I also had the opportunity to start and lead as CEO my own biotech, where I managed to raise some capital, venture capital, and negotiate with Pfizer to acquire some unwanted compounds from my portfolio, former portfolio at Pfizer. And then with some colleagues, we ran clinical trials, were successful, and that company was acquired by Novartis in 2017. So to those who've criticised me and said I'm an embittered ex-employee, one, I really like working at Pfizer. And two, they really like working with me. And it was only as recently as 5 years ago that a transaction was done. They were a co-owner and co-investor in my biotech. So I think we would say we had a very cordial relationship and left on mutually good terms. And I was fortunate to make a few pennies. So I'm not speaking out to make money, and I'm definitely not speaking out to make fame. I'm actually probably quite a shy person, and this is intensely difficult for me, but I'm speaking out because I don't think what we are being told at all represents the sort of real sort of threat to our health. And we could talk about a few of those points. But yes, I have been a persistent, and I think well qualified critic of government policy.
At what point, Mike, and for what reason or reasons did alarm bells start to ring for you?
Yeah. Early on in 2020, I was in Nice with my wife when we heard tell of this virus coming, and I was really quite frightened. The annual Nice Carnival closed a day early. It's only about 30 miles, I think, from the northern Italian border, and we were very conscious that the virus could be in the crowd. I looked at the statistics, and it looked like at that age, 60, I might have a 1% chance of dying. I didn't fancy that, so I was quite worried. We went home, and as we came up towards the first lockdown, my concern moved to consternation, because I heard government advisors saying things that I just didn't understand why they were saying them, because I knew they weren't true. I could give a couple of examples about saying, well, we're not sure if you've survived this virus whether you'll be immune. And I thought, well, immunology 101 will tell you that you should expect to be immune for a substantial period of time, possibly for life. And so at that point I started listening and thinking, why are you saying these things? I also went to check what data there was in the public domain, like the Diamond Princess. There was an big outbreak on a cruise ship, mostly occupied by people of my age and older, which are the prime group to get ill and die. and yet it looked like the lethality was at least 10 times less than they were telling us from Wuhan. And so I thought, by the end of it, I thought, the actual threat in the environment is not much worse than a severe influenza. It's not influenza, different virus, but that's the measure of the threat. And yet suddenly we started doing astonishing things like lockdowns. Seriously, it's so that's what around March. And my wife reminds me that after the first 3 weeks to flatten the curve, when it was extended, she reminds me often that I was tearing up and down the stairs saying, we are in so much trouble. I knew at that point. So seriously, I knew at that point something very bad was happening, and I'm afraid the impression that something bad has happened, as a professional scientist, it's been absolutely obvious to me by May 2020 that I'm afraid it's nothing like you've been told, and I don't want to get you or your station into difficulty, Neil, but I'm very happy to exemplify, if you want, what I mean by the things that we've been told to do are not appropriate. So you guide me. I don't want to run the ship of GB News on aground.
You allege that we've been lied to.
Yeah.
I think that it's fair to summarise.
Yes.
You say we've been lied to. That some of the information that we've been given by government and their advisors was deliberately misleading. Now,
all of it.
Data, what information is it that you have seen, and in what way have you been able to interpret that information, that data, that you feel entitled to make the allegation that you've made?
Yes, certainly. So many things are harder than others, but one thing I will say to your listeners, I've given many interviews, so you can decide whether I'm telling the truth or not. You can go and check whether what I say is true or not. So the long form interview I gave to an American journalist called Dale Bigtree, sorry about my speech, The High Wire, the program's called The High Wire. So if you search that, it's about an hour-long interview. So I did go through all of the things that I would answer to your question. We don't have time today. But essentially, I'm going to give you one example. We've been told, have we not, to act like we've got it, that essentially people without symptoms can infect other people. It's called asymptomatic transmission. And it underscores pretty much every one of the measures, regular testing of people who haven't got symptoms, wearing masks, even though you've no symptoms, social distancing, business closures, school closures, border controls, all of those hang on this idea that you'd be a walking virus bomb. It's not true. It's simply not true. And I can explain why it's not true, and then I can refer you to published information that shows it's not true. So first, in order to be a good source of infection, you have to have lots of virus in your airway, your upper airway in your nose, so then you can breathe it on other people. But if you have lots of virus in your airway, you will have symptoms. It's not possible for you to grow a culture of virus burning through the lining of your airways and not give you symptoms. Equally, when you have these infections, your immune system fights back, raises your temperature, gives you symptoms. So you can't have high levels of virus and no symptoms, but you can't be infectious, highly infectious, without lots of virus. So I'm afraid asymptomatic transmission is not true. That's the theoretical approach. However, it's also been studied practically. And again, I can put it in the notes afterwards. Probably the biggest paper studied hundreds of people who were PCR positive with symptoms and PCR positive without symptoms. The latter are so-called asymptomatic cases. They then studied the frequency with which people infected family members. And the people with symptoms infected a family member about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 times. People without symptoms was way under 1%. And that was using PCR tests that have got some kind of low level of background false positive. I believe that data shows that people without symptoms are not able to infect other people. Then I'm going to say 2 other things. Dr. Anthony Fauci is on tape, recorded last year, saying, in all the history of respiratory viral epidemics, the driver of it has always been a symptomatic person. He says exactly those words on camera. And then Dr. Maria Kokovi of the WHO said exactly the same. In our studies, she said, we've looked for the frequency with which so-called asymptomatic cases infect other people. We are not finding any. So there you go. That's the theory, the published literature, and the statements from very senior figures in the US and WHO advisory. So why is it our government, France's, Italy's, Germany's, are all saying something different. Well, sorry, it's clearly part of a plan. Why do I say that? Until 2020, and I went and read them, and your listeners can go and read them, each country had a pandemic preparedness plan for events like this. And the only two things those plans contained were, if you are ill, stay home until you're better, and wash your hands more often, because we don't know initially what the transmission route is. The rest of the documents spend 10 pages telling you why it's not justified to mass test the population, to close the borders, to restrict business activities or close schools. So all the things that we're actually doing, I think every one of those is a lie, is inappropriate, and they're all being pushed by all the governments at the same time. And I think why they're doing that is to frighten us. Why they're doing that is to induce us to get vaccinated. And why they're doing that, I'm afraid, is I think vaccination passports are digital ID. And that's what I think this is about. So that's long story short.
It's a controversial line that you're taking. It's a line though that I have heard from other people in other places. But you say that you have the data, that you have read and seen the data that enables you and justifies you making that assessment. Yes.
Yes, it's my professional job, I would say, to detect patterns in data. So I'm looking for relationships between the data and an overall theory. And my job is also to try and push it over. So I try and think, well, is what I'm saying true? Can I find any exceptions? And the answer is, a couple of colleagues of mine, Doctors Claire Craig and Jonathan Engler, did an exhaustive review of the evidence for asymptomatic transmission. That's a small publication you can go and find. I think it was 7 case reports, 5 or 6 were from China. So I'm afraid we're not able to necessarily check that data. And there was one famous case in Europe of an executive that came back from China and visited several plants in Germany, infecting I think 16 of her colleagues. And the claim was that she was asymptomatically transmitting it, but actually some German journalists followed up within the first 2 days and found out that she had flu, and she'd been taking over-the-counter remedies to kind of barrel through her day. That is the totality of evidence supporting asymptomatic transmission, and decades of evidence, including statements by Fauci and the WHO, go in the opposite direction, including, as I mentioned, papers, peer-reviewed journal articles that have studied this do not find it. So I put it to your listeners that that's a central plank. That's a central plank of policy.
Mike, if you bear with me, one of my guests here tonight, Scarlett Maguire, a former Labour advisor, is making it plain to me that she has something she'd like to ask you.
My problem is that I caught COVID from asymptomatic. I mean, there were 19 of us at my mother's funeral. None of us had any symptoms. Within 2 days, 15 of us had come down with it. Some quite seriously, one in hospital. And I mean, obviously somebody at that funeral had the beginnings of it, but there were no obvious symptoms. I mean, you hear that again and again. I don't understand how you can say that it's just not
true. That's anecdote. I'm not going to argue with your anecdote. I won't do that. Scientists don't argue with anecdotes are not data. So I'm not going to agree or disagree with you. What I'm saying is, when you study it systematically and study hundreds of people who have PCR positive tests but no symptoms, and PCR positive tests with symptoms, and explore over weeks and months how many infect other people, you find that 17% if you're symptomatic and approximates the false positive rate for the test if you're asymptomatic. And there are dozens of papers like that. So I'm not saying it never occurred. It's very important, in fact, that you understand I'm not saying it never occurs. What I am saying is it's epidemiologically irrelevant. It does not drive epidemics. Fauci says it doesn't. Kokobi says it doesn't. The literature says it doesn't.
Mike, you've spoken at length and with some feeling against mass vaccination. Which at the moment there is a concerted attempt to vaccinate the world. You oppose that. Why?
I find that very, very frightening. I would say to people, the appropriate use of any treatment would be to prevent disease or treat disease in the people who are vulnerable. And we know there's a 1,000-fold difference in the vulnerability of people, and it accords with their age. So if you're old and frail and have multiple other illnesses, just like influenza, you can really quite likely be killed by these things. But if you're under 60 and completely well, and certainly with children, in the case of children, in Germany and Sweden, not a single child has died after infection with SARS-CoV-2. So I would say, most people would say, and this is, we did this with influenza for decades. We offer it to people who are in the twilight of years. I mean, I'm 60, not quite twilight, but I qualified for a flu vaccine for the first time last year. But my 35-year-old children weren't offered it. Why do people think this is something we should give to everybody? And I will just say, if this was about public health, there are three things at least that wouldn't happen. If this was about public health, we would not give it to people who've already had the infection. It's been studied. There are over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles now that show if you've recovered from this infection, you are immune. In fact, to a far greater degree than if you've had the vaccines, because the vaccines only give you the taste of the virus, the spike protein, not the nuclear protein encapsid. So you would not expose people to a vaccine if they've already had the infection, because they're immune already. And yet we're trying to vaccinate everybody. There was that doctor yesterday talking to Mr. Javid. He said, I've already had the disease, I'm immune. He can't catch it and he cannot transmit it. So he's the safest person in the hospital to be around. So that's one thing. The next you wouldn't do is to inject children. Children, as I just mentioned, in all of the history of SARS-CoV-2 infection in Germany and Sweden, probably other places, but those two have a full public disclosure and they've had 0 child deaths. So why would you want to risk? I would say that even if I didn't know the side effect, I would say just don't give it to children. There's a third category, and I've studied this personally. You would not give it to pregnant women. Pregnant women, by definition, are in the younger age group in order to have children. And have people forgotten thalidomide? For goodness sake, we don't give experimental medical treatment to pregnant women, not since 1960. I was born that year. I have a cousin with one hand missing. So,
Mike, there's a very strong body of opinion would rail against what you're saying there, and would say that well, I'm not of the scientific fraternity, but you're clearly very confident and committed that your analysis of the scientific research that you're reading takes you in this direction. How and why would you say that you are able to run counter to so much of a dominant narrative coming from governments and coming from a large part of the scientific community?
Yes. Well, one, I would challenge whether there is this, as it were, dominant narrative. There's certainly a narrative message. Vaccinate children, vaccinate pregnant women, and so on. But I've looked in the peer-reviewed literature, and it is true that, as with influenza, having COVID during pregnancy does slightly elevate the risk to the mother. It's not as big an elevation as with influenza, but my point is not that. The point is, did you know this, that no reproductive toxicology studies have been completed with any of these vaccines? So what I'm saying is, no one knows what the consequences are, if any, on the developing fetus. No one knows. So that's a concern. And then theoretically,
as I said, we've got time running against us here.
Okay.
I think it's so valuable. I think to hear the take that you have on this broad spectrum, wide-ranging, controversial story, and that I think it's undeniable that we do not have long-term data of the kind that I suppose everybody on all sides of the argument wants, and that we're still waiting for enough time to have passed, enough research to have been done before we have that data. But Mike, I have to move on. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for making the time for us, and I'll hope to continue this conversation at a further point. Dr. Mike Yeadon, their former Chief Scientific Advisor. My panel are still here. Emma Webb, commentator.